So I'm going to start with these kind of stages of grief, and this is my first time really talking through this in this way. So um, I'm not sure. I gave us 45 minutes, but we will see how quickly it goes, and then maybe we can just have more discussion. But yeah, and then I kind of also wanted to like set the stage with like what it was like for me to be an evangelical, because it, you know, everyone has their different journey. For me, it wasn't just that I grew up in a religious household that and was kind of forced to go to church. I really loved it. I was into it in college. I went to a Christian college, and when I had a difficult decision to make, I would actually fast, and I would spend the day praying. There was a little prayer chapel on campus, and so I would actually like maybe have a little coffee in the morning, but then just not eat anything, spend the day journaling. At the time, I mean, I guess I had a phone, but I would disconnect, and I would just I would do that. I would sometimes go. If it was in San Diego, I would go down to the beach at night and kind of look at the stars, and felt very connected to spirituality in that way, and to this higher power. And it was a big part of my life for sure. In that sense, I led small groups. I worked at a church one summer. So that's kind of the background in how I experienced evangelical Christianity. And so the first stage of grief is disbelief. And so I think the very first doubt I really had, though, was actually back in childhood, and I remember it very vividly. I was in choir at my church, and so we would have choir practice. It must have been like a weeknight or something like that. And so we would have practice, and then we'd have a little break in the middle. You'd get a snack, you'd sit outside, and then you'd go back in. And I was like one of the good kids, and my friends were too. And so we were sitting there and talking and laughing and having this great time. And they called us to go back inside the building, but we were around the corner, so we didn't hear it. And so then all of a sudden we were like, oh my gosh, the break is over. We're supposed to be back inside. And it was just this kind of rush of adrenaline. And it was like the immediate thought I had as like an 8-year-old was like, well, if everything's perfect in heaven, then we wouldn't get this to happen. Like if we were in heaven and everything was just perfect, then we would just always be on time after the break. And so it was this kind of funny way that I was just like, that doesn't make sense. Like what, that doesn't sound fun, but then it's supposed to be perfect. And so it was like the doubt came from heaven first. It wasn't, and later on, the idea of hell was something I had to process that was just, I would consider it inherently unloving to have that kind of misery exist for anyone. But it was really heaven first that I doubted from a very young age. And but then I think the next big, or I would say like the first truly big question that I had came when I was in college and was studying business, but my school had this program where we could go work at a church over the summer that was associated with the college. And so I went to Hawaii to work at a church, which for someone who loves the beach, it, was amazing. It sounded like a dream summer to go, stay at someone's house and work at this church, and was working with the youth. The pastor of that church, though, was very fire and brimstone. He was from the East Coast and was like, he always wanted everyone to be on time for stuff, and that's not Hawaiian culture at all. But he was very much about the rules, and so there was this miscommunication that happened, as we were getting ready for, it was like a youth camp that, just like he thought one thing, I thought another thing, but because he was the pastor and I was this like student volunteer, I got called into this meeting, And then he yelled at me for 45 minutes, and I was crying the entire time. And it was just like, at that time, I believed that someone who was a pastor had this kind of, they were chosen by God, and they had almost like a special super high way of communication with God. And so I was like, well, if he thinks that I was like purposely disagreeing with him, then how, like, and that's not the experience that I had. Like, I thought that I had good intentions and that I was just trying to like facilitate things. So it just completely changed the idea of authority of like a figure in the church. But then it also was just like, well, what's the authority of how these beliefs, in the Bible are understood? And then, from there, it's just like, how many people have translated the Bible or like passed it down over many years. And so it really just was like the kind of first thread of something that unraveled. And it was an understanding that different Christians believe different things. And that, what I grew up in, which was 7-day creation. So understanding that there were different ways to be a Christian. And so that really was like the start of unraveling. So the next stage of grief is denial. And so this is a really interesting story. I actually wrote an article about this. It's online on New York Magazine. But so this actually goes back, though, to high school. I had a crush on the guitar player at church. And I was at like a church camp. We were all like on a church camp kind of beach trip. It was in August, and I was up really late one night, and I was praying, and I was like, everyone was kind of in their tents asleep, but I just could not sleep. And so I was up and I was praying, and I was like staring at the stars, and I started to see shooting stars. And August in Southern California, there's a meteor shower that happens, which I think I kind of knew, but I still just decided, like, if I see 10 shooting stars, that means that I'm meant to marry this person. And so I kind of just like, in hindsight, I kind of just twisted things because I knew the outcome that I wanted. And I wanted that trust that in like a very vulnerable, early teen, experiencing romantic feelings for the first time. Like, I wanted to know that was safe, because at that time I thought romance was just about finding the right person to marry, and that was it. That was what you're supposed to do. So it makes sense in hindsight, but at the time, that's kind of what I twisted around. And so then after college, after I've started having these doubts, I graduate college. I haven't spoken to this guitar player in at least 4 years, barely was ever friends with him, just kind of made eyes across the room, and nothing ever happened. And so it's been years since I've spoken to him, and just realized, like, I've moved to San Diego for college. I want to move somewhere else. I'm not going back to our hometown. He's still there. We're just not going to get married. That's not going to happen. But I was in denial because I never doubted God. I was like, oh, I must have misunderstood. But I never thought like, oh, well, maybe my concept of God was totally wrong. So, and it actually, you would think that it would be, you'd think that it would have caused like more doubts to come up, but it really didn't. And so it was kind of a strange, like, when you believe something is part of your world view, you just kind of stick with it, and things pop up that challenge it, and you just kind of brush them under the rug, like, oh, I must have been confused. It's fine. So that was my moment of denial. Awesome. I want to take a quick look at comments. Yeah, Chris, definitely. Yeah, it's the idea of heaven falls apart very, very quickly when you think of it that way. Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Thanks for sharing that. And thanks, Valerie. It's helpful to know that you resonate with the story. I think, yeah, the church crushes and God designating someone for you to marry is a very, I've heard it a bunch of times from other people too. So the next stage is bargaining. And so for me, how this really came out was, so I'm having all these doubts. I'm graduating from college, and I kind of used my mom as a way to deal with arguments in my own mind. So I'm like, becoming a more like progressive Christian and inclusive, and, exploring some like other realms of Christianity that were, that could believe in evolution, and the Garden of Eden story is a poem, and like, some of these ideas that were challenging a lot of like the core beliefs that I had at the time. And so because my family was more conservative, and I would have these like back and forth like Bible verse arguments with my mom, and in hindsight it was really unfair to her, but basically what it allowed me to do was to use her as like I was having the argument in my head, and so then I could use her as like one side of it, so that I could challenge and argue and play it out. And also I think there's when you're changing your beliefs, a lot of your identity and safety comes from the social circle you're in. At that time, all of my friends were Christians, and so it was kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to change these beliefs, but like, are these people still going to love me? And so I think it was like kind of challenging and like pushing, because it was like testing. It was like testing to see, how is this going to change things? If I don't believe these certain things anymore, am I just going to be cut out? Because that's what it seems like happens. It does happen many times. And Lisa, my mom is still a very devoted Christian. Her politics have changed though. So she was very apolitical for a long time, and now she reads about politics a lot. And I wouldn't say I know like all the details of her beliefs, but she's as much as I say like it was unfair of me to argue with her in that way, because it was very self-serving for me. I do think that that I was able to bring up, some questions that might have influenced her later on. So then the next stage is guilt. And so this really came out when I published the memoir. And so if people have come on more recently, I talked in the beginning how I wrote a short memoir that was about intimacy and religion, and how I dealt with this question of, is premarital sex wrong? And like, are you ruining your chance at ever having, healthy intimacy if you like one time engage in premarital sex? So that's what the book was about. And I wrote it at a time where I had my old Christian friends that I grew up with, and then I had newer friends that I, worked with, that I knew from San Francisco or from New York. And so it was sort of, I don't know how I did this, like maintain this with like a Facebook profile and all of that, but it was like my Christian friends didn't know that I was like more liberal and progressive, but then my other friends didn't know that I used to be a Christian, or that I, grew up very conservative. And so so I wrote this book. I self-published it. I hired an editor, and I felt like, at the time, there's been more books that have come out that focus specifically on sexuality, but at the time there wasn't a lot. This was 2017, And I felt like telling a personal story was important and that it would help other people who dealt with the same issue. So I felt like it was really important to put it out there, but it kind of forced me to come out as a whole self to these different friend groups. And as you can imagine, one group, the non-religious group, was very, very supportive and, understood like this is very vulnerable, you're telling your story. And then the Christian side was kind of, I think they were intrigued, but kind of felt like they'd been fooled in a way, like that I hadn't been honest with them because I hadn't told them the stages of the journey. I just was one day like, here's my book about how my beliefs have changed. And so that was a little strange and caused some tension in those relationships. But it's funny that the name of the book is Shameless. And of course that is kind of teasing the idea of shame as a theme in the Bible and Jesus' death and wiping away shame and so on, but also in terms of intimacy and shame in that sense. But it still brought up a lot of guilt that that I had kind of. It almost felt like had let down this old community by changing, by becoming a different person. Because it's sort of like you grow and you become a different person, but then you're not the person that they chose as a friend. And so it's kind of, this part of many of our personal journeys is that we change and grow, but then we have to walk away from friendships or create a new friendship with the same person. And there can be a lot of guilt in that. And there definitely was for me, and feeling like I needed my own space and my privacy to process these things, but then that meant that I couldn't, continue to bring those friends into every step of the journey. That's awesome, DM. That sounds like amazing work that you're doing with energy and chiropractor. Yeah, and that it can feel that way, and it can look that way. And if my 15-year-old self knew who I was now, they would definitely think that I went to the dark side. That's exactly what that version of me would have thought, and I think that's why I felt that criticism. Even when it wasn't coming from anyone else, is because I was different than who I used to be. And yeah, Mike, yeah, it's true. It's and I think we humans are just social, and we're social animals, and that that sense of safety that comes with a group is genuinely important. And so sometimes it does take a process of creating new relationships before we sever the old ones. And we just have to kind of be in tune with our needs. And at some point, yeah, you realize that if you have to hide part of yourself to be in friendship with someone, then it's not a truly supportive friendship. Yeah, that's different ideas of what's healthy for your parents. I can definitely relate to that. That is a very sensitive, very difficult topic, especially when you disagree basically on the concept of the world that we're living in. Yeah. Awesome. I love the hula hoop. Thanks, Valerie. And actually, I love that Chris just mentioned this, the legalism and only their way is the way, because the next stage is anger. And I mentioned earlier about Facebook groups or just social media groups in general. On Twitter, there's certain hashtags, and so as I was promoting this book that I wrote, I was in a lot of these groups of former evangelicals, and it was very supportive. And you could, for a lot of these people, they couldn't talk to anyone in their real life about what they were going through, but they were finding people online. They could talk about it. And a lot of it was very angry. And it makes sense. My story, I think, in the greater scheme, my story is pretty mild. I'm still in good terms with my parents, but a lot of people have very, very much more traumatic stories. And so in these groups, there are a lot of people who are very traumatized coming together. And there's a lot of anger. There's anger at, the time that you wasted, the things that you didn't do because you thought it was wrong, the ways you limited yourself, the ways you didn't get to be fully yourself. And so there can be, that grief for that time, but also a lot of anger at people that taught you these things. And so I went through that. It was a stage. And I think a big part of it was actually feeling like, oh, this thing that I learned, this Christian thing, is totally wrong, and now everyone needs to know. And so it was like the irony, though, is that evangelicals want everyone to believe what they believe, but then as an ex-evangelical, then I was turning around and being like, I want you all to now believe what I believe. And so it's kind of like it goes both ways. And having been brought up in believing that there's one truth, then when I changed my truth to be more inclusive, but it was like, I didn't realize I still was in this mindset of that there could only be one truth. And then I was like, oh, well, like my former Christian, friends and family members need to get caught up and, not believe in hell anymore, because I mean, that's one of them that it feels inherently unloving to me, the idea of hell. And so wanting to convince people of that and change their beliefs. But it's falling for the same trap as, and it's, from another perspective, it's inherently unloving to need someone else to believe the same things that you believe, even if you think your beliefs are more loving than theirs. So it's a difficult one, and it was definitely a stage of anger and wanting to convince others to take the same journey that I was on at the same time. Yeah, Mike. Yeah. And I actually, the reason I chose to do this on Sunday morning, for a long time, I would listen to a podcast. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Rob Bell. I read a lot of his books as a Christian and then kind of followed his disillusionment journey. But I would sit in bed with coffee on Sunday mornings and listen to the podcast. And that was kind of, it felt supportive because it does, when you spend so many years, some of us probably spent like 20 years going to church every Sunday. It can be very strange on Sunday mornings to not be doing that. And so that was something that was supportive for me for a long time, to have kind of a sort of sacred moment for myself. And so that's why I chose to do this on a Sunday morning, because just in case other people feel that way as well. And I've kind of adopted the new and the full moons as sacred moments for myself too, because I feel like there is something to having that rhythm in your life, and I think church does a great job of that, being every single week. But there's other ways, like Chris is saying, getting out in nature every week or on a regular basis can be really supportive in terms of bringing that sacredness back into your life. Awesome. So the next stage is depression. There's only a couple more stages. And so this was another stage of kind of, I had released this book about intimacy and religion and was, in these groups and had a podcast and was interviewing people. And what I really found is, I kind of, in promoting the book, I wanted to present myself as this thought leader and like this like pioneer around this deconstruction from Christianity idea that was kind of building up steam, and especially after the 2016 election, that was really a time when a lot of people started to question their beliefs. So it was kind of really around that time. And what I found was that, I kind of alluded to this, but a lot of people had been through experiences that were just far more traumatic than I had. You know, I grew up in a very conservative community in Orange County, in California. And, sure, we believed in 7-day creation, and we're against gay marriage and these things. But I maintained, positive relationships with my family. After, a few issues, managed to maintain positive relationships with friends. And so it just wasn't quite what people had been through who maybe were from a different part of the country, or had a different family dynamic, or, a different sort of identity to deal with, where they really had been, pushed out. And so I think that's where kind of the depression came in, was that I wrote the book wanting to help a lot of people and kind of lead this new way into this, this deconstruction mindset and new life outside of church, and just feeling a lot of what people are dealing with, it's just over my head, and it's not as much as I want to help people. I'm not really equipped to do so. I put the book out there, people find it, they message me sometimes and say that it helped, and that's great. But I had planned to write a deeper, a complete spiritual journey book. And I just kind of was I'm not even the person to do this, because my story, it's not that unique, and it's not supportive to most of these people who have been through something that was far worse. So yeah, and I think also some of the depression was thinking that once I made this change and left that belief system, that way of life, everything's going to be great, and life is still life. And my friends who are still Christians are very happily married, starting families, going to church, and I'm, doing what I do. And so it's not I think you kind of expect you've been through this whole drama of deconstruction, that you get to the other side and then things are just going to be a lot better, and but you do still have life, and you can't expect all of the people that made a different choice to have difficulties. There's we are just on these different journeys. So it's so much happens, and then also not a lot happens. So then the final stage is acceptance and hope. And so after I had released this book, as I was dating, I would be on dating apps, and sometimes I'd actually just put it in the description, because it's a fairly personal book to have out there, and some people are just not that comfortable with that. So, and then some people think that it's really cool. So, but I tended to feel I had to date people who, as a Christian, I thought I needed to date people who were a Christian. And then as a non-Christian, or more progressive Christian, I thought I needed to date people who used to be a Christian, because I was how else are they going to understand me? I've been through a lot, and it affects everything. And so it felt important for a long time. This is my identity. This is what I used to be, is my identity. And then one day it wasn't anymore. And, now it doesn't even really come up. Like the book is still out there on Amazon, but, unless I get like really deep into a conversation that goes that direction, it's actually not a big part of my identity anymore. And, I've moved on to new things, and I don't feel the need to introduce myself as having written this book. There's other things that have become more important as the years go by. And so I think that was a really interesting shift into, that's why I like to use these stages of grief, because I feel like it was a grieving process of letting go of something that, the worldview of it provided a lot of safety. The social group involved in religion provided a lot of safety. And so it took all of these stages to kind of test and pull away and move past it. And like I said, like there was definitely anger. There was definitely like that depression of like, well, I thought everything was going to be fixed, but it's just kind of new stuff. And then, I think you really need to engage in each stage, but when you do, you can get to that point where it's not actually that important. And that's when you know that you've really healed from something, when it's not that big of a deal anymore. And so the final place that I wanted to take us was, what I didn't expect was that I would want to have faith again. And because I was taught this system that you can trust God and cast all your cares upon God, and that that was very real and it was very useful for me, and then doubted it, and then I walked away from it. But then there was this, I got to this point where stressful things came up. I was in between jobs, and I was like, I would like to pray right now. I used to be able to pray when things were, kind of unknown and stressful, and then I would feel better. And like, maybe I don't believe that whole system, the Bible being inerrant and all the beliefs that went along with that, but even if like you could prove to me that there is no God, like I think I would still choose to pray, and whatever that needs to mean. But I felt like there was still value in that. And so it was then kind of a new journey to say like, okay, well, how do I find this trust again? And like, what does that mean? And yeah, so I think that's kind of where I wanted to leave things. That I think, and I'm always changing and evolving as I learn new things. I think that's one takeaway I have, is that I will never again have full faith in a specific system, but it's just much broader than that, and that I kind of see different religions as almost like different systems for how you access the divine, but that one is not better than the others, but a lot of them have been used for many, many years for very good reason, that they provide value to people in seeking the divine. And I think the idea that one thing that still really resonates with me is like a higher power more as like a force rather than a personal God. And I actually, when I pray, sometimes I still like pray to God as if it's a person that I'm talking to. And then other times I sort of lean on like the force of the universe. So I kind of do it both ways. But I think that was really helpful for me, because it feels like it just makes a little bit more sense in terms of like the idea of like bad things tend to happen. Like bad things happen, good things happen. And so seeing there being like a greater force in everything feels more resonant to me than like there's a God as a person being like, these people get a tornado and these people don't. So I would say like that's one of the takeaways that helped me discover this trust and this support in something greater than myself that was apart from any specific religion. So we'll take a quick look, and thank you everyone for all of your comments while I was sharing. It was really supportive for me to know that people are resonating with what I'm saying, and then also I know for everyone else who's listening, it can be nice to have different connection points to the content itself. So thank you for being such a wonderful group. Yeah, unequally yoked with an unbeliever. Yeah, that one was difficult to get outside of. And Chris, I do have a group. It's Mindfulness with Danny. It is very small. I just started it recently, but please, everyone is welcome to join. And it's I just like to offer it as kind of a way to keep in touch in between lives. And if there's any other topics that you want to hear, I'm always open to that too. What I usually do is a new moon and a full moon ritual with a meditation, and those are about every 2 weeks or so. Awesome, Mary. Yep. All systems that allow a connection to God. Totally agree. Thank you, Mary. Mary number 2. It's 2 Marys comments in a row. Awesome. Yep, and thank you, Seeds. Yeah, thank you, Chai. Yeah, we are all on journeys, completely different journeys. I met someone recently who told me that they recently became a Christian, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I mean, there's so many different ways to be a Christian, and very many churches now that are very inclusive and progressive, and so it's you can't really ever judge anyone else's journey, because there's probably a reason for why they're being drawn one way or the other, and we can only know what our own journey is and kind of have that trust in ourselves that we are in the right place at the right time. So thank you everyone for being here,